Hi everyone, can you hear me? I see we have people driving, we have people at home, we have people in their offices. If you're driving, everyone be safe. So, good evening. We're here. Welcome to Vocatio Talks, a 30-minute webinar where we will attempt to explore the connection between our work and our faith. I am Dr. Ben Reese, and I serve as the Associate Dean for Vocational Formation here at Abilene Christian University. I am deeply grateful and honored that you've chosen to spend your time this evening here with us. Before we get started, a few housekeeping matters. I'm going to share a few things over the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have time to do a bit of Q&A the last 10 minutes. So at the bottom of your screen, somewhere around there, you should see a Q&A button. If you have a question that comes to mind during our conversation, I want to invite you to click on that button, submit your question, and depending on how many questions we get, we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as we can in the latter part of our time together. So this evening, I want to talk a bit about the transformative practice of silence. It goes by a bunch of different names. Some call it mindfulness, others call it contemplation, still others prefer the term meditation. But regardless of how one labels it, it is all really the same. And in the course of my life, I've always been told that the practice of silence and solitude is important and that it's good for me. But it's only been in the last 4 years or so that I've actually attempted to pursue practices of silence, practices of contemplation. And to be frank, it didn't come naturally to me. I was forced into silence by life circumstances, or perhaps silence forced its way into my life. I'm not sure which direction it went. But as with many transformative moments in our lives, it was through a difficult season that I discovered a new way of being. So in the spring of 2011, doctors found a tumor in the spinal cord of my wife's younger brother, Ryan. It was stage 4 glioblastoma cancer. It is the worst kind of brain cancer that almost no one survives. So over the next year and a half, we watched and we walked with Ryan as he endured surgery and chemo and experimental trials and naturopaths and more chemo and lots of pain meds. And a year after the initial diagnosis, so this is in the spring of 2012, after multiple attempts and progressively worse diagnosis, doctors gave Ryan 3 to 6 months to live. Ryan and his wife, Jess, two people that my wife and I were very close to, had 2 young children. Jones was 5 at the time, India was 2. And as you can imagine, and as many of you have experienced yourself, I'm sure, the experience and anticipation of loss in a season like that is unspeakable. It's unbearable even. Around about that same time, the congregation that I was serving in the Seattle area stepped into its own season of grief. We had 5 people die in the span of 12 weeks. And we're a small church of 125, which I find out here in Texas, that's like a Tuesday night Bible study. But we're small. In Seattle, if you're 125, you've actually got a chance of making it. But 5 deaths in 12 weeks. 29-year-old suicide, 62-year-old lung cancer, 46-year-old ovarian cancer, 30-year-old leukemia, and the patriarch of the church, Nolan, 73 years old, died of T-cell lymphoma. And Jennifer, who's the wife of Nolan, is also the mother of the woman who died of ovarian cancer. So she lost her daughter and her husband in the span of 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, there wasn't a Sunday where we weren't either worshiping the day after a funeral or announcing a new diagnosis of terminal illness or announcing a death. So every which way I turned, there was death. Consumed my entire life. I spent all of my days in the hospitals and with grieving families, and then I'd go home to my wife and my 3 kids, and all 5 of us were grieving the impending death of my brother-in-law, Ryan. So in October of 2012, Ryan went on hospice, and then November 1st, my wife and I drove the 2.5 hours from Seattle to Vancouver, Washington to help Jess in caring for Ryan in his final days. And 1 week later on Wednesday, November 7th, at 12:37 p.m., Ryan passed away. And we spent the next few hours what you always do in those moments. We cried, we told stories, we managed to laugh a few times, we tried to remember to eat something, and we started making plans for the funeral. And that same evening of Ryan's death, around 5 o'clock, I started feeling pain on my right side that moved towards my back. It was just a bit uncomfortable at first, but by 8 p.m. that night, it was just unbearable. I was sitting with my wife and my best friend and a handful of other friends, and I decided, or should I say it was decided for me, that I should go to the hospital. And by the time I got to the hospital, I was at blackout levels of pain. To make a very long story, made slightly not as long, that night I was admitted into the hospital. I got progressively worse and worse. By the next Monday, November 12th, I was transferred to the ICU unit where I kept getting worse. On Friday, November 16th, so this is 9 days after I've been admitted, my body starts shutting down and doctors opt for emergency exploratory surgery in hopes of finding something that the 5 CT scans and 2 MRIs had yet to detect. So they cut me open, and that's where they found an abscess near my right kidney that they think started this whole downward spiral of infection. And they closed me up with 30 staples, and they put 2 tubes in me. They kept sucking fluid out for the next 10 to 12 days. And from that moment on, I slowly but surely started getting better. And then on November 29th, so this is 22 days after being admitted into the hospital, 15 of which were in the ICU, having missed my brother-in-law's funeral, having gone 17 days without eating or drinking anything, being in a hospital 3 hours away from my home and my church and my children, I'm discharged, we make the drive back up. And I was at that time terribly anxious to get back to work, but I needed another month to convalesce. And in January, I was able to go back to work, but it was just part-time as I was still recovering. And it was work that I had mostly loved for 15 years. It was work for which I'd been trained and work for which I felt gifted. But as I came back to work, I discovered this serious disconnection between myself and the church, myself and God, myself and my own sense of vocation. So as church members complained about worship music or chair arrangements or any of the other really important life and death matters that we complain about in church, where once I held the capacity to patiently listen, and not necessarily to the issue about which they were complaining, but for what was really going on, now I didn't have the same kind of patience. I couldn't hide my frustration, and it tended to be my face that would give it away. It would communicate something like, "Are you kidding me? I mean, of all the things that we're talking about, we're actually talking about this." And I would sit in front of a text, trying to work on a sermon or a Bible class, and I would find nothing. I was so angry. I was angry at God. I had no desire to pray, let alone work on a sermon. I had no desire to pursue a life of faith, let alone serve as a leader in an institution whose primary purpose was to encourage others to pursue a life of faith. I would look around at the church and I wonder, what are we doing here? We're disconnected from one another. We're disconnected from our community. Are we actually going to do anything that matters in the world? Which inevitably led me to ask the questions, what am I doing with my own life? Does any of this matter? Does it make a difference? Because everything that I'd come to really care about after my illness seemed terribly disconnected from what I was actually doing. It was at this point of crisis that I was fortunate to be invited into a few relationships. I was invited into a few initiatives that forced me into practices of contemplation, practices of silence. And these aren't new groundbreaking practices. In fact, they've been at our disposal for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But there in the silence, I discovered a few things. I had for too long been very disconnected from my sense of self. I had been disconnected from my passions. I'd become disconnected from my calling. I discovered that much of what I've been doing for my adult life was growing out of this massive need to be liked or to be seen as smart or relevant or to be popular. So what I found is that what I had become was just this collection of versions of myself that I would project, versions of myself that grew out of what I thought people wanted from me or what they explicitly stated they wanted from me. And I also discovered as a professional Christian for so long that a life connected to God was thin at best. That my relationship with God was this loose construction of being a passable preacher and having a lifetime of experience knowing what to say and a constant need to win God's approval. So I felt pretty good about at least knowing these things about me. So I go back to my mentors and I shared with them all that I had learned, and I asked, okay, what's next? And they all said the same thing to my disappointment. They said more silence, more silence. What happened next, and it wasn't by any means immediate, it wasn't overnight, but I slowly found myself with a sense of what it means to be more deeply rooted and more grounded and centered. Through seasons of silence and practices of silence, I found myself less anxious and less critical and less prone to be angry. I had, for what felt like the first time, a stronger sense of my own identity. And in addition to that, I felt comfortable with my own identity. I began to identify what I really cared about, the stuff that connected deeply within me. And I don't think these things like changed much over my lifetime, or that there was a dramatic shift from pre-illness to post-illness in regards to the stuff that I cared about. That stuff was always there. It was always a part of who I had been. But I think my illness was disorienting enough, right? That what I found in the silence is all of those constructions and projections and versions of myself that I'd spent so many years building and defending that they're called into question. Okay, so what does this mean for you? What does this mean for us? Of the few things of which I'm convinced, this is one of them. Most of us live at such a chaotic and busy and overconsumed and over-consuming pace that we blaze through life largely inattentive to who we are and the world around us. The list of to-do items that each of us have is so long, right? I mean, we seldom have the opportunity to be fully present in the current moment, because as soon as we finish one thing, we find ourselves moving on to the next. In fact, I would argue that most of us enter a situation or conversation either consumed with whatever just happened or thinking about the next thing to come. And this makes it really hard, if not impossible, to be present to the situation, the people right in front of us. This includes being present to our very selves. And so what I want to argue is this. If we could find regular moments to be still, to breathe, to take account of our own emotional world, we will be less anxious. We will be more present with the people around us. We will find a greater connection and a sense of meaning in our work. And I think we'll be overall healthier people. So I have three things for us. I have good news, I have bad news, and then I have an invitation into some practices. So good news is this. Studies have shown that people who regularly practice silence or contemplation have lower blood pressure, more restful sleep, better immune systems, sharper memory. They report higher levels of happiness, satisfaction, and joy. So the data is extensive, and the data is really hard to argue anymore. There are noticeable biological and emotional and spiritual benefits to simply slowing down, being still, and breathing on a regular basis. Your life, without a doubt, will be made better. That's one. Two, bad news. It's not always easy. We are addicted to noise. We're addicted to our need to feel productive, to always be moving. Right? As good Westerners, it's hard for us to slow down and to be still. And also, and this is the case for me, the problem with silence is that you're left with just yourself. You take away the noise of television and music or phones and the myriad other distractions that we have, and all we're left with is what's happening in our mind and what's happening in our hearts. And the problem with this is that most of us, I think, would choose to be distracted than to deal with all that we carry on and here and in here. So there's a guy named Martin Laird who wrote a great book called Into the Silent Land. And he has this fantastic quote. He says this, quote, "It is difficult for most of us to be silent because of the inner chaos that's going on in our heads, like some wild cocktail party of which we find ourselves the embarrassed host. Often, however, we are not even aware of how utterly dominating this inner noise is until we try to enter through the doorway of silence." End of quote. It is really, really hard to enter silence because we are, as people, and I don't want to project too much onto you, but I think we're all a bit of a mess, aren't we? We have so much pain and baggage and anxieties and fears and hopes and joys that it's just really hard to work and to sift through it all. But back to the good news. If we can find space to attend to all that stuff that's going on, we'll be better husbands and wives. We're going to be better mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers. We're going to be better employees, employers, and better neighbors and better humans and better church leaders and leaders within our communities. And on top of all of that, we won't be held captive to this chaos and busyness that defines our world. And more good news, you don't have to almost die to give it a try, I promise. In fact, you don't even have to go on a silent retreat. You don't have to go on a pilgrimage. You don't even have to block out enormous chunks of time in your day. So I want to give you 3 simple, easy, but transformative practices for us to try. First one is this, 5 minutes a day. Take 5 minutes out of your day. Perhaps it's during a lunch break, or when you normally watch the morning or evening news. Perhaps it's during a natural break in your workday. But just take 5 minutes to do nothing but be still. No screens, no phones, no music, no podcasts, just peace and quiet. 5 minutes to just breathe. 5 minutes. That's one. Second is this. So Andre Delbecq, he was a professor at Santa Clara University, and he's very well known in his work in management and leadership, a man of deep, deep faith. And one of the things he invited students, regardless of their religious conviction, and working professionals, regardless of their working convictions, was to practice a thing that he called threshold meditation. Threshold meditation is this. When you're standing on the threshold of leaving one task and entering another, take the smallest amount of time. Take 10 seconds. Goodness, one deep breath would suffice. And take account of what you're bringing into the next task and recenter yourself to be fully present with the people and task you're about to enter. That's threshold meditation. So let's say you just received an email that raises your anxiety or your frustration, and you're about to head into a meeting with a colleague, right? It's there on that threshold, leaving the email and stepping into a meeting, that's a good place to pause, to breathe, to recognize the anger or anxiety or frustration, and remind yourself that the next situation, and more importantly, the next person, isn't to blame, right? Okay, third thing I want to invite you into, and this is connected a bit to Delbecq's threshold meditation. Whenever you find yourself feeling a strong emotion, good or bad, I want to invite you to take 3 deep breaths and simply recognize it. Whether it's anger or joy, hope or hopelessness, frustration or delight, boredom or creativity, in that moment, take 3 deep breaths and recognize it. Nothing more than that. You don't even have to be alone to do this, right? You can be in the middle of a meeting surrounded by a bunch of people and do this. It's really, really simple. And research has actually shown that the ability to recognize our own emotional landscape actually helps us respond out of those emotions in healthier ways. So that's your invitation, right? 5 minutes a day, threshold meditation, and 3 deep breaths in response to strong emotions. And if there's anything the last 4 years can tell me, it's this. It's not always going to be easy, but I'm convinced that your life will be transformed. I'm convinced that the communities you serve and that you with whom you live are going to be transformed. Okay, it's 7:20. I've said too much already. What questions do you have? I want to invite you, if Devin, if you can unmute yourself. I don't know if anyone sent any questions to you, or if you have questions, there's a little raise hand button, and we'll click on that. What questions might we have?
We've got one that's come in. So one of the students said, how is what you're talking about different from prayer? And do you consider that the same thing as prayer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would want to say, let me speak autobiographically. I've come to understand prayer less about getting God into my life and more about me trying to align my life with God's. And we work really, really hard in saying lots of things and asking for lots of things. And there's something about silence where I just bring and I'm fully present that invites us to trust that God's Spirit will actually do some work in the silence. Perhaps bring up a person that we've sort of buried, or bring up a situation that we're not tending. That there's something about silence where we're not the ones in control, right? That's the frightening thing about silence, is that we're not in control of it. Where I think God does some really, really good, important work. So I'd want to say it is a form of prayer, one where we open up all that's happening within us to the movement of God. That's a great question. Anyone else? We have 8 minutes, and so it's silence. And so if we just sit here for 8 minutes in silence, it would seem appropriate.
Ben, I have a question.
Yeah.
I was concerned with whether or not this silence need to be in a lighted situation or dimmed light, or what is the degree of light that is necessary, and also if in a lighted situation, with the visual stimuli, do we need to close our eyes, or is it just simply meditation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anthony. And that was Anthony who asked it, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it just depends on who you are and where you're at. There's sometimes where I feel like I have to close my eyes because there's so much visual stimulation, even if I'm out in the middle of nature and there's really nothing going on. Sometimes I'm able to keep my eyes open. So I would invite you to do what's ever comfortable. So what the Christian mystics invite you to do is to sit in a comfortable position with feet on the floor, and just take whatever feels natural. So I would say that's a trial and error, and that's going to be dependent on each of us, our own preferences and ways that we just are distracted or not. So that's a good question. So my answer is no answer at all. You'll just have to figure it out.
I find that during the night when I wake up that I have the opportunity to meditate and to think about, invite God to come and talk to me about all the busyness. And that seems to be the only time in my life that I'm really still. So I take advantage of those moments where I'm not sleeping.
Yep. I think that's a great, and we just have your email address, TLT17A. What's your name?
Terry.
Terry, that's a really great observation. And one of the things I'd encourage anyone who's trying to give it a go is to find a moment where silence is already a little bit natural for you, right? For some, it might be in the morning where it's a little bit quiet before the busyness of the day. For others, it might be later at night, perhaps after the kids are in bed or after you turn off the TV. But find a spot in your day or in your week where it's already natural and try to fit it in there. That's a great reflection, Terry. Oh, okay, so I see this question in the text. I can imagine that threshold meditation would be helpful not just in the workplace, but at home and at church. Do you have any reflections on that? Yes. What's interesting is after I was introduced to Del Beck and his work around threshold meditation, is I was reminded of what a marriage therapist told me to do before I walked into the house every day. And that was to not get out of my car and to just sit in my car for a few minutes. And my hunch is many of us have experience around this, that whatever anxiety or whatever stress or whatever stuff happened at work is really, really easy to walk into the house with. That I could find, I get home and I'm irritated at my children or I'm frustrated with my wife, but it has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with the stuff that happened in that day. So taking a moment to just sit and to be still and to go, okay, this is the stuff that happened. I'm going to try as best I can, let go of that stuff so I can be fully present. And I mean, goodness, it's true in our church communities, in faith communities, any volunteer work, that threshold meditation could be a lifesaver and really could help all of us develop really good and effective leadership skills. Other questions? Okay, so this question, how much silence or contemplation do you do now? Does it get easier or harder? So what I try to do, and I'm not always, I'm mostly faithful in it. I do 20 minutes of silence every morning. I tend to get in the office really early before anyone else does, and so that's a good place for me. My house is too crazy with dogs and children to try to do it there. So I try to do 20 minutes of silence every day, and then I try to find 2 5-minute slots in my work day, and I tend to allow my emotions. If I'm really angry or if I'm frustrated, I'm realizing that much of what I'm saying makes me out to be a very angry or frustrated person. That's not true. But in moments when I find myself, my emotions getting up, those are moments where I'll say, okay, just 5 minutes and breathe. And does it get easier or harder? Yes, it does. There are moments in which silence and contemplation, the 20 minutes flies by and I could do another 10 or 20. There's moments when I could feel my heart rate go down and I recenter myself and I'm able to attend a bit better to what's going on. And then there's other times where it's just miserable, where my mind is racing so fast. There's so much stuff coming in and out that I can't really even find my way, and I feel like someone's just spinning me around. And there's times where even though this has been such a significant place of connection with God and a redevelopment of a sense of faith, there's also seasons where it just feels really dry. But I've done enough and I've weathered enough dry seasons to know that things eventually turn. So yes, it gets easier and it gets harder, all those things. Anyone else? Okay. Every time I practice silence, someone asks, sometimes I have a hard time quieting my mind, and sometimes I'm just easily distracted. Is there anything I could do to prevent this? Okay. So one of my mentors who teaches in the Abilene campus at ACU, a guy named Randy Harris, has kind of 3 rules that I think are really, really good. Whenever we enter into silence, no matter how long or how short it might be. 3 rules: no agenda, no expectations, and no judgment. Those are 3 really, really important rules. They're really important for me, having grown up in a Christian tradition where sort of my relationship with God was dependent on getting things right. Right? No one ever said that to me explicitly necessarily, but that's sort of what was ingrained in me in many ways. That being able to enter into silence with no agenda, no expectations, no judgment, and allow it to happen as it does, and just to be gracious to ourselves, I think is really, really important. I'm fairly convinced that God is less anxious about our relationship with God than we are. That there's something about being still and knowing that He is God. And so if my mind is racing, sometimes I'll just take that as a sign that I'm really distracted and just try to pay attention to it. Sometimes there's a really helpful practice, at least for me, where if you imagine yourself on the banks of a river and the thoughts that are racing through are floating the river on boats, and you just acknowledge it and let it go down and pay attention to the next thought, that sometimes quiets my mind. And then if I'm easily distracted, my number 1 rule is just to be kind to myself, to not make myself feel worse because I'm not more focused. Because anxiety and judgment seldom help us be better people. So actually being gracious to ourselves, I think, can point us in a healthy direction. So, okay, we're 1 minute over. I'm really grateful for everybody who is here. I don't know if I missed anybody who may have raised their hand with a question. My apologies. I really want to invite you to find moments to just be still and to just breathe. I really want to invite you and encourage you to be kind to yourself, to take even if it's just 10 seconds, and take 3 deep breaths and recognize who you are. One of the things I want to do as we develop these webinars that we're going to do every 8 weeks during the off weeks for students who are ACU online is to make sure that this is a worthwhile, encouraging time and opportunity for you. So within the next week, I'm going to send everybody a little survey. I did it after the first one. It'll take less than 30 seconds to fill out, really, really simple. But I value your feedback. I'm interested in topics around your vocation, your faith, your work, that would be helpful for us in a broader community to have a conversation around for these webinars. So if you can, do a huge favor for me and just hit reply and fill that out. Deeply grateful for all of you. So grateful for your work. I'm hopeful that your time here with ACU, or if you're a prospective student, or if you're just a community member joining us, that you are continually seeing that your work is not incidental to the life and mission of God, but is integral. No matter what you do, if it participates in a flourishing community, you're participating in the life and mission of God. So thanks, everybody. Wherever you are, have a wonderful evening, and be silent. Bye, everyone.